On a bone-chilling November night in 1963, the fog rolled across Puget Sound like a living thing, swallowing the lights of Seattle in its gray embrace. Through the murky darkness, the imposing silhouette of Granite Isle Federal Penitentiary emerged from the black waters, a fortress of concrete and steel that had never been successfully breached in its 30-year history. The island prison, built on a jagged outcrop of rock 12 miles from the mainland, housed the most dangerous criminals in the Pacific Northwest. Tonight, 3 men inside its walls were about to attempt the impossible. The wind howled through the guard towers, carrying with it the salt-tinged promise of a storm. In cell block D, the harsh fluorescent lights had dimmed to their nighttime amber glow, casting long shadows between the bars. The sound of waves crashing against the island's granite cliffs provided a constant, rhythmic reminder of the treacherous waters that surrounded this maximum security prison. Vincent the Brain Romano lay on his narrow cot, staring at the water-stained ceiling of cell 47. At 37, he possessed an intellect that had both elevated and damned him. His IQ of 1442 had made him a master manipulator on the streets of Chicago, orchestrating bank heists with surgical precision until federal agents finally cornered him in a Detroit warehouse 3 years ago. Now that same brilliant mind was focused on a single, seemingly impossible goal: escape from Granite Isle. The soft scraping sound from the cell next door told him that Tommy Chen was still working. In cell 46, the 28-year-old former Navy demolitions expert methodically filed away at the concrete around his ventilation grate, using a spoon handle sharpened against the stone walls over months of patient effort. Tommy had grown up on the docks of San Francisco's Chinatown, where survival meant knowing every angle, every shortcut, every way to disappear when trouble came calling. His expertise with explosives had made him invaluable to the West Coast crime syndicates until an armored car job went wrong, leaving 2 guards dead and Tommy facing life without parole. 2 cells away, in cell 44, Marcus "Bull" Patterson sat cross-legged on his floor, his massive frame making the cell seem even smaller than its 6 by 8 foot dimensions. At 42, Bull was the oldest of the 3 conspirators, a former longshoreman whose strength was legendary, even among the hardened criminals of Granite Isle. He could bend the steel bars of a cell door with his bare hands, if not for the specially reinforced titanium alloy the prison used. Bull had been sent here after a warehouse robbery turned into a 3-hour shootout with police, during which he'd single-handedly held off 2 down officers while his crew escaped. Only he had been caught, and only because he'd run out of ammunition. The 3 men had been brought together by circumstance and desperation. When the prison administration had placed them in adjacent cells 6 months ago, they'd quickly recognized kindred spirits, intelligent, resourceful men who refused to accept their fate. Romano's strategic mind, Chen's technical expertise, and Patterson's raw strength formed a perfect trinity of skills needed for the impossible. It had started with whispered conversations during mealtimes. Coded messages passed through the prison's underground network of communication. Romano had been the architect of the plan, studying every aspect of the prison's security, memorizing guard rotations and identifying weaknesses in the facility's design. Chen had provided the technical knowledge needed to breach the prison's physical barriers, while Patterson's connections among the long-term inmates had provided access to tools and materials. The plan they'd devised was audacious in its complexity. For months, they'd been slowly excavating behind their cell walls, removing chunks of concrete and concealing their work behind fake panels made from soap, toothpaste, and paint chips. The ventilation system of Granite Isle had been their target, a network of passages that, according to the original architectural plans Chen had memorized during his brief stint as a construction worker, led to an access tunnel running beneath the main cell block. Tonight, as November rain began to patter against the barred windows, Romano reviewed every detail of their escape plan one final time. The guards would make their final rounds at 11:30 p.m., By 11:45, the three men would have widened their ventilation openings enough to slip through. From there, they would follow the air ducts to the maintenance level beneath the prison, where months of careful observation had revealed a vulnerable exit point near the old utility pipes that fed the prison's heating system. But escape from the building was only the beginning. Granite Isle sat in the middle of Puget Sound, surrounded by frigid waters that had claimed the lives of every prisoner who'd attempted to swim to freedom. Romano's plan accounted for this. They'd spent weeks collecting materials to construct an improvised raft, raincoats stolen from the laundry, life preservers fashioned from stolen cork and canvas, even a paddle carved from a plywood table leg that Patterson had accidentally broken during a scuffle in the workshop. The raft was hidden in the abandoned section of the prison's basement, in a storage room that hadn't been used since the facility's construction. Getting there would require navigating a maze of corridors and avoiding the automated security systems that monitored the prison's lower levels. But Romano had spent months studying the guards' patterns, timing their movements to the second. He knew they had a 15-minute window between patrol sweeps, barely enough time to reach their hidden supplies and make it to the shoreline. As the prison settled into its nighttime routine, Romano's mind drifted to the intelligence reports he'd gathered about the waters surrounding Granite Isle. The currents were treacherous, the temperature deadly, and the distance to the nearest mainland was 12 miles of open water. Most experts believed it was impossible to survive the crossing on a makeshift raft. But Romano had studied oceanographic charts, weather patterns, and tidal flow. He knew that on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the tides aligned properly, there was a narrow corridor of calmer water that could carry a small craft toward the shipping lanes near Seattle. Tonight was one of those nights. The sound of footsteps in the corridor snapped Romano back to the present. Guard Captain Williams was making his rounds, his heavy boots echoing off the concrete floors. Williams was a 20-year veteran of the prison system, a man who prided himself on running the tightest cell block on the West Coast. He'd boasted that no prisoner under his watch had ever successfully escaped, and he'd built his reputation on that perfect record. Romano feigned sleep as the guard's flashlight swept across his cell, the beam probing every corner for signs of contraband or suspicious activity. Williams paused for a moment, as if sensing something amiss, but the cell appeared normal. The carefully constructed facade that Romano and his accomplices had built over months of preparation held firm. "Sleep tight, Romano," Williams muttered, his voice carrying a hint of the contempt he felt for all the prisoners under his authority. "Tomorrow's another day in paradise." As the guard's footsteps faded down the corridor, Romano opened his eyes and checked the small clock he'd fashioned from stolen electronic components. 10:47 p.m. Less than an hour until their plan would begin in earnest. He could hear Chen's breathing in the next cell, quick, nervous inhalations that betrayed the younger man's anxiety. Even Patterson, normally unflappable, had been unusually quiet during dinner, his massive hands trembling slightly as he ate. Romano understood their fear. They all knew the stakes. If they were caught attempting to escape, they'd be transferred to solitary confinement for years, possibly decades. Worse, they might be sent to one of the federal black sites prisons that didn't officially exist, where troublesome inmates simply disappeared. But the alternative, spending the rest of their lives in this concrete tomb, was even worse. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Romano took it as a good sign. The storm would provide cover for their escape, masking any sounds they might make and reducing visibility for the guards in the watchtowers. The weather reports had predicted heavy rain and fog throughout the night, perfect conditions for three desperate men to vanish into the darkness. At 11:15, Romano began his final preparations. He'd spent weeks crafting a dummy head from papier-mâché, using soap, toothpaste, and concrete dust, mixed with hair clippings stolen from the prison barber shop. The result was crude but effective. In the dim light of the cell, it would pass for a sleeping prisoner during a casual inspection. He positioned the dummy on his pillow, arranged his blankets to suggest the outline of a human body, and checked his work from multiple angles. The ventilation grate in his cell had been his project for the past 4 months. Using tools improvised from stolen utensils and scrap metal, he'd slowly enlarged the opening, while maintaining the appearance of an intact grate. The work had been painstaking. Too much noise would attract attention. Too much debris would be noticed by the cleaning crews. But tonight, the grate would swing open like a door, revealing a passage just wide enough for a man to crawl through. At 11:28, Romano heard the signal, 3 soft taps on the wall from Chen's cell. Patterson responded with 2 taps from his cell, confirming that he was ready. Romano's heart began to race as he realized that the moment they'd planned for so long was finally at hand. In less than 3 minutes, Captain Williams would make his final rounds of the evening. After that, they would have until 6-7 a.m. before the guards discovered their absence. The footsteps approached again, Williams conducting his nightly inspection with military precision. Romano held his breath as the guard's flashlight swept across his dummy, praying that months of careful work would hold up under scrutiny. The light lingered for what felt like an eternity, but Williams moved on, apparently satisfied that all was normal in cell block D. As the guard's footsteps faded into the distance, Romano waited for the sound of the security door closing at the end of the corridor. The electronic lock engaged with a soft click, sealing the cell block for the night. Now they had their window, 15 minutes before the next automated security sweep, 45 minutes before the guards would return. Romano carefully removed the false panel from his ventilation grate, setting it aside with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control. The opening beyond was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He could hear similar sounds from the adjacent cells as Chen and Patterson prepared their own entrances into the prison's ventilation system. The plan required perfect timing. Romano would go first, followed by Chen, then Patterson. They would crawl through the air ducts to a junction point Romano had identified, then drop down into the maintenance level below the cell block. From there, they would retrieve their hidden supplies and make their way to the shoreline on the island's north side, where the raft waited in a concealed cave. Romano took one last look around his cell. The concrete walls that had been his world for 3 years, the narrow window that offered a tantalizing glimpse of freedom, the steel bars that had held him captive for so long. After tonight, he would never see this place again, whether he died in the attempt or succeeded in reaching the mainland. There would be no coming back to Granite Isle. He squeezed through the opening into the ventilation shaft, his body barely fitting in the cramped space. The metal ductwork was cold against his skin, and the sound of his breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Behind him, he could hear Chen following, the younger man's quick movements suggesting barely controlled panic. The ventilation system was a maze of passages, some large enough to crawl through, others so narrow that Romano had to worm his way forward on his belly. He navigated by memory, having spent months studying the prison's blueprints and mapping every turn and junction. A wrong turn now could trap them in the system, or worse, lead them directly into the path of a security patrol. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Romano reached the junction point, a larger chamber where several air ducts converged. He waited for Chen and Patterson to catch up, their heavy breathing echoing in the metallic space. Through a grate in the floor, he could see the maintenance level below, a dimly lit corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits. "This is it," Romano whispered, his voice barely audible. "Once we go through that grate, there's no turning back." Chen nodded, his face pale but determined. Patterson simply grunted his agreement, his massive frame barely fitting in the cramped space. All 3 men understood that they were about to cross a line from which there was no return. Romano carefully removed the grate, using tools Chen had fashioned from stolen materials. The opening was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through, and the drop to the floor below was about 8 feet. Romano went first, lowering himself through the opening and dropping silently to the concrete floor. The maintenance level was a forgotten realm beneath the prison, a network of tunnels and chambers that housed the building's mechanical systems. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the constant hum of machinery provided cover for their movements. Romano had spent weeks studying this area during his work assignments, memorizing every corridor and identifying the route to their hidden supplies. They moved in single file through the labyrinthine passages, Romano leading the way with the confidence of someone who had mapped every inch of their route. The storage room was located in the oldest section of the prison, an area that had been sealed off years ago when renovations made it unnecessary. Getting there required passing through 3 security checkpoints, each with its own risks and challenges. The first checkpoint was a motion sensor array that covered a main corridor. Romano had timed the sensor's sweep patterns during his reconnaissance, identifying a 12-second window when the beams were repositioned. They waited in the shadows until the sensors cycled, then sprinted across the corridor in a coordinated dash that left them breathless but undetected. The second checkpoint was more challenging, a camera positioned to monitor a junction where their route intersected with a main maintenance corridor. Chen had prepared for this obstacle, carrying a small mirror he'd stolen from the prison barbershop. By angling the mirror carefully, he could redirect the camera's view just long enough for them to slip past unnoticed. The third checkpoint nearly ended their escape before it began. A guard was conducting an unscheduled inspection of the mechanical systems, his flashlight beam sweeping through the corridors as he checked various equipment. The 3 escapees pressed themselves against the wall in an alcove, hardly daring to breathe as the guard passed within inches of their hiding place. Finally, they reached the storage room where their supplies waited. Romano's hands shook as he opened the concealed compartment where they'd hidden their makeshift raft and other equipment. Months of patient work had gone into assembling these materials: raincoats sewn together with stolen thread, life preservers stuffed with cork and foam, paddles carved from scrap wood. It wasn't much, but it represented their only hope of crossing the deadly waters that surrounded Granite Isle. As they gathered their equipment, Romano checked his improvised timepiece. 12:47 a.m. They'd been moving through the prison's underground passages for over an hour, and their window of opportunity was narrowing. The next security sweep was scheduled for 1:15 a.m., giving them less than 30 minutes to reach the shoreline and launch their raft. The route to the water required them to exit the prison through a forgotten maintenance tunnel that led to the island's waste treatment facility. From there, they would have to traverse a quarter-mile of rocky terrain to reach the concealed cave where they planned to launch their escape attempt. The terrain was treacherous in daylight. In the darkness and rain, it would be nearly impassable. Romano shouldered his portion of their supplies and headed toward the tunnel entrance. Behind him, Chen and Patterson followed in grim silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about what lay ahead. They all knew the statistics. The water temperature in Puget Sound averaged 45 degrees in November, cold enough to kill a man in minutes. The distance to the mainland was 12 miles of open water, with currents that could carry them out to sea or dash them against the rocky shores of the Sound's numerous islands. But Romano had done his research. He knew about the shipping lane that passed within 2 miles of Granite Isle's northern shore, and he'd calculated the tidal flows that could carry their raft toward the busy waterway. If they could reach the shipping lane, they might be rescued by a passing vessel. If not, they would at least die as free men rather than spending the rest of their lives in concrete cages. The maintenance tunnel was a nightmare of rust and decay, its walls weeping with condensation and its floor slick with accumulated grime. They crawled through the narrow passage for what felt like miles, their clothing soaked through, and their hands cut by sharp edges of corroded metal. The sound of waves grew louder as they approached the tunnel's exit, and Romano felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized they were nearing the point of no return. The tunnel emerged in a small chamber carved into the island's rocky shore, hidden from view by an overhang of granite. Through the chamber's opening, Romano could see the storm-tossed waters of Puget Sound, white caps visible even in the darkness. The rain was falling in sheets now, driven by winds that would make their crossing even more perilous. They assembled their raft quickly, using the techniques Romano had memorized from smuggled engineering magazines. The raincoats formed the raft's main body, sealed with tape and rope stolen from the prison workshop. The life preservers would provide buoyancy, while the wooden paddles would give them some measure of control over their direction. As they worked, Romano couldn't help but think about the other men who had attempted to escape from Granite Isle. In 30 years, 17 prisoners had tried to flee the island. All had been recaptured or presumed dead. Their bodies never recovered from the Sound's frigid waters. Tonight, 3 more names might be added to that grim list. But Romano pushed such thoughts aside as he helped launch their makeshift raft into the churning waters. The vessel rode low in the water, barely large enough to support their combined weight, but it floated. Chen and Patterson climbed aboard carefully, trying not to upset the raft's precarious balance, while Romano gave it a final push before hauling himself up onto the crude platform. The current immediately began to carry them away from the island, the raft spinning slowly as they struggled to control its direction with their improvised paddles. Behind them, the lights of Granite Isle grew dimmer, while ahead lay 12 miles of dark water and an uncertain fate. Romano checked the luminous dial of his stolen watch one final time. 1:43 a.m. In less than 5 hours, the guards would discover their empty cells and realize that the impossible had happened. 3 men had successfully escaped from the most secure prison in the Pacific Northwest. As their raft disappeared into the storm-shrouded darkness of Puget Sound, Romano allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Whatever happened now, they had achieved something that experts said was impossible. They had broken free from Granite Isle. The waves grew larger as they moved away from the island's protective shoreline, each swell threatening to swamp their fragile craft. Romano gripped his paddle tighter and began to stroke toward what he hoped was the mainland, knowing that the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. In the distance, barely visible through the rain and spray, the lights of Seattle beckoned like a promise of freedom. But between them and safety lay miles of treacherous water, unpredictable currents, and the very real possibility that their daring escape would end not in triumph, but in the cold embrace of Puget Sound's depths. As the raft rose and fell with the storm-driven waves, Romano realized that their fate now rested entirely in the hands of the merciless sea. Behind them, Granite Isle had vanished into the darkness, as if the prison had never existed at all. The only sounds now were the crash of waves against their raft, the whistle of wind through the rigging they'd improvised, and the labored breathing of 3 desperate men who had wagered everything on a single impossible chance at freedom. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, their destiny waited. The first wave that nearly killed them came at 2:07. Romano saw it building in the darkness, a wall of black water rising like a mountain against the storm-torn sky. For a moment that stretched into eternity, their makeshift raft climbed the wave's steep face, the 3 men clinging desperately to the rope handles they'd woven into their craft. At the crest, Romano caught a glimpse of the chaos around them. Endless ranks of waves marching across Puget Sound, like an army of liquid giants, each one capable of sending them to the bottom. Then the wave broke. The raft plunged down the water mountain's backside, spinning like a leaf in a hurricane. Chen screamed as he was nearly thrown overboard, his fingers digging into the slick raincoat material that formed their vessel's hull. Patterson's massive arm shot out, grabbing the younger man's jacket and hauling him back onto the raft just as another wave crashed over them, filling their makeshift craft with icy water. "Bail!" Romano shouted over the storm's roar, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Use anything." They had no proper tools for bailing, only their cupped hands and a single plastic container. Chen had stolen from the kitchen. Water sloshed around their knees, weighing down the raft and making it sluggish in the waves. Each man took turns frantically scooping water overboard while the others paddled, their movements becoming increasingly desperate as hypothermia began to set in. Romano's teeth chattered uncontrollably as he fought to maintain their heading toward the shipping lanes. His stolen watch showed 2:45 a.m., which meant they'd been on the water for over an hour. At this rate, they would all be dead from exposure long before they reached the mainland, if the waves didn't claim them first. Behind them, Granite Isle had vanished completely into the storm. Romano wondered if their absence had been discovered yet, or if their dummy heads were still fooling the overnight guards. Either way, it wouldn't be long before Captain Williams made his morning rounds and found 3 empty cells where his most dangerous prisoners were supposed to be sleeping. At precisely 6 a.m., Officer Janet Kowalski began her routine cell inspection of Block D. A 15-year veteran of the federal prison system, Kowalski prided herself on thoroughness. She checked each cell methodically, ensuring that every prisoner was accounted for and that no contraband had appeared overnight. Cell 44, Patterson, Marcus. The massive man lay motionless on his bunk, his broad back turned toward the bars. Kowalski moved her flashlight beam across the cell, noting nothing unusual. Cell 45, empty, scheduled for a new arrival next week. Cell 46, Chen, Thomas. The young man appeared to be sleeping soundly, his dark hair visible on the pillow. Kowalski paused, something nagging at her subconscious, but the cell looked normal. Cell 47. Romano, Vincent. The notorious bank robber lay facing the wall, his breathing slow and steady. Kowalski had always been wary of Romano, too intelligent, too calculating. But this morning he seemed as harmless as any sleeping prisoner. She completed her rounds and returned to the guard station, signing off on the overnight report. All prisoners accounted for, no incidents to report. It wasn't until 7:15 a.m., when the breakfast bell rang and the cells were unlocked for morning meal, that the impossible truth was discovered. "Jesus Christ," Officer Kowalski whispered, as she stared into Romano's empty cell. The dummy head lay on the pillow, crude but effective in the dim morning light. The ventilation grate hung open like a gaping mouth, revealing the darkness beyond. The alarm siren began wailing 30 seconds later. Captain Williams arrived at Block D within minutes, his face flushed with rage and disbelief. For 20 years he'd maintained perfect security in his cell block. No escapes, no riots, no major incident. His reputation was built on that record, and now 3 of the most dangerous criminals in the federal system had made him look like a fool. "How the hell did this happen?" he demanded, surveying the empty cells with mounting fury. "Where were the overnight guards? Why didn't anyone notice?" Officer Kowalski stammered her report, explaining how the dummies had fooled the standard inspections. Williams cut her off with a vicious curse, already calculating how this catastrophe would destroy his career. The media would have a field day. 3 dangerous criminals loose in the Pacific Northwest, and the prison that was supposed to hold them had been outsmarted by soap and toothpaste. "Get me Warden Blackwood on the phone," Williams barked, "and contact the FBI, the Coast Guard, and every law enforcement agency within 500 miles. I want roadblocks, helicopter searches, marine patrols, everything." He paused at the entrance to Romano's cell, studying the sophisticated modifications that had enabled the escape. The concrete around the ventilation grate had been painstakingly chipped away over months, then concealed with a mixture that perfectly matched the original material. The work showed intelligence, patience, and skill, exactly what he'd expect from Vincent Romano. "Sir," Officer Martinez called from Chen's cell. "You need to see this." Williams joined the younger officer, who was examining the wall behind Chen's bunk. Hidden behind a carefully constructed false panel was a cache of improvised tools, sharpened spoons, wire cutters fashioned from stolen metal, and detailed diagrams of the prison's layout. "They've been planning this for months," Martinez said, his voice filled with grudging admiration. "Look at these drawings. They mapped every inch of the ventilation system, every guard rotation, every security checkpoint." Williams felt his stomach drop as he realized the full scope of what had happened. This wasn't a spontaneous escape attempt by desperate men. It was a carefully orchestrated operation that had taken months to plan and execute. Romano and his accomplices had turned their imprisonment into an elaborate intelligence-gathering mission, studying every aspect of the prison's operations until they found a way to exploit its weaknesses. By 8:00 a.m., the full weight of the federal law enforcement apparatus was descending on Granite Isle. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres arrived by helicopter, her sharp features set in grim determination as she surveyed the crime scene. At 38, Torres had built her reputation on tracking down escaped criminals, and she'd never failed to bring a fugitive back to custody. "Tell me everything," she demanded as Williams briefed her on the escape. "How long have they been gone? What resources did they have? Where would they go?" Williams handed her thick files on the 3 escapees, his hands shaking slightly as he recounted the morning's discovery. Torres scanned the documents quickly, her analytical mind already processing the information and formulating a pursuit strategy. Vincent Romano, genius-level intellect, master planner, extensive knowledge of criminal operations throughout the Midwest. No known relatives, no obvious safe houses. Thomas Chen, demolitions expert, former Navy, connections to organized crime on the West Coast, family in San Francisco's Chinatown, possible refuge. Marcus Patterson, enforcer, extensive criminal network, known for violence and intimidation, associates throughout the Pacific Northwest. They'll need transportation, money and shelter, Torres mused, studying surveillance photos of the 3 men. Chen's family connections make San Francisco a likely target. We'll start there. But even as she spoke, Torres felt a nagging doubt. Romano was too smart to run toward the obvious sanctuary. The man who'd orchestrated this elaborate escape wouldn't make such a basic mistake. There was something else, some element of the plan that they hadn't uncovered yet. Coast Guard Captain James Reeves joined the briefing, bringing grim news from the Marine search teams. "We've been scanning the Sound since dawn," he reported. "Water temperature is 43 degrees, waves running 8 to 10 feet. If they tried to cross in these conditions, they're already dead." Torres studied the nautical charts, spread across the conference table, tracing possible escape routes with her finger. What about the shipping lanes? Could they intercept a vessel? Possible, Reeves admitted reluctantly. There's regular traffic between Seattle and Vancouver. If they timed it right, they might reach the commercial corridor. But surviving the crossing on a makeshift raft, in these conditions, it's suicide. 3 miles northwest of Granite Isle, Romano was beginning to think Captain Reeves might be right. The storm had intensified as they struggled through the darkness, each wave seeming larger than the last. Their raft was taking on water faster than they could bail it out, and hypothermia was setting in despite their desperate efforts to stay warm. Chen had stopped shivering 20 minutes ago, a sign that his body temperature was dropping to dangerous levels. "How much farther?" Patterson shouted over the wind, his powerful strokes barely keeping them moving forward. Romano checked his compass, trying to maintain their heading despite the raft's constant spinning. 5 miles, he called back, though he wasn't sure they could survive another 5 minutes, let alone 5 miles. A searchlight suddenly blazed across the water, sweeping back and forth in a systematic pattern. Romano's heart pounded as he realized what it meant. The escape had been discovered, and the manhunt had begun. The light passed within 100 yards of their position, so close that he could see the Coast Guard cutter's hull cutting through the waves. "Down," he hissed, and all 3 men flattened themselves against the raft's deck. The searchlight swept over them again, but their dark clothing and the storm's chaos provided camouflage. After several terrifying minutes, the cutter moved on, continuing its search pattern to the south. Romano waited until the vessel's lights had disappeared, before allowing himself to breathe again. They'd been incredibly lucky. The searchers were focusing on the area closest to the prison, assuming that any escape attempt would head directly for the nearest shore. But Romano's research had identified a different route, one that would guide them toward the shipping lanes where larger vessels might provide rescue. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the water, growing louder as the aircraft approached their position. Romano could see the aircraft's spotlight sweeping the waves, its powerful beam turning night into day wherever it focused. This time, there would be no hiding. "When I say jump, we all go over the side," Romano instructed, preparing for the worst. "Hold on to the raft, but get as low in the water as possible." The helicopter passed directly overhead, its spotlight missing them by mere yards. The pilot was flying a search pattern, covering every square mile of water between Granite Isle and the mainland. Romano counted at least 3 aircraft in the air, their lights crisscrossing the sound like deadly fireflies. As dawn began to break over the Cascade Mountains, Romano realized that their original plan was no longer viable. The massive search operation would make it impossible to reach the shipping lanes undetected. They needed a new strategy, and they needed it fast. There, Chen pointed weakly toward the northeast, where a small island was barely visible through the morning haze. "We could." Romano studied the landmass through the growing light. It was one of dozens of small islands scattered throughout Puget Sound, most of them uninhabited and rarely visited. If they could reach it undetected, they might be able to wait out the initial search intensity before attempting to reach the mainland. But the island was at least 2 miles away, and their raft was barely staying afloat. Patterson had passed out from hypothermia 10 minutes ago, and Chen was delirious from cold and exhaustion. Romano himself was beginning to lose feeling in his hands and feet, making it increasingly difficult to paddle effectively. The decision was made for them when another massive wave crashed over the raft, nearly capsizing them completely. As Romano fought to right their craft, he saw that one of the raincoat seams had torn open, creating a gash that would sink them within minutes. "We're going down," he announced grimly. "Everyone grab whatever you can carry. We swim for the island." Chen looked at him with glassy eyes. "I can't, too cold." "You swim or you die," Romano replied harshly. "Those are your only choices." They abandoned the sinking raft and struck out for the distant island, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated from hypothermia. Romano had learned to swim in the frigid waters of Lake Michigan as a child, but even he struggled against the Sound's punishing conditions. Behind him, he could hear Chen's labored breathing as the younger man fought to stay afloat. Patterson, despite his unconscious state, proved to be the strongest swimmer. His powerful strokes carried him steadily toward the island, his body's natural buoyancy helping to keep him afloat. Romano grabbed Chen under the arms, helping to support the exhausted demolitions expert as they struggled through the waves. The swim felt like it lasted hours, though Romano's watch showed only 37 minutes when they finally reached the island's rocky shore. All 3 men collapsed on the pebbled beach, their bodies shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. They had survived the crossing, but they were still 12 miles from the mainland, with every law enforcement agency in the Pacific Northwest hunting them. Romano forced himself to his feet and surveyed their refuge. The island was perhaps half a mile long and heavily forested, with steep cliffs on the seaward side that would provide some concealment from aerial searches. There were no obvious signs of human habitation, but Romano spotted what looked like an old fishing cabin hidden among the trees. "Come on," he gasped, helping Chen to his feet. "We need shelter." The cabin proved to be abandoned, but structurally sound, with a stone fireplace that could provide warmth without creating visible smoke. Romano found dry clothing and canned food left behind by the cabin's last occupants, along with fishing gear and a small boat motor that might prove useful later. As they huddled around a small fire, Romano assessed their situation with the analytical precision that had made him such a successful criminal. They had escaped from Granite Isle, the impossible first step in their plan, but they were still trapped on a small island in the middle of Puget Sound, with limited supplies and every authority in the region searching for them. Outside, the sound of helicopters continued to echo across the water, their search patterns drawing ever closer to the island. Romano knew it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. When that happened, they would need a new plan, something even more audacious than their prison break. He studied the nautical charts he'd memorized, visualizing the layout of Puget Sound and the various escape routes available to them. There was a way off the island, but it would require precise timing and more luck than any sane man had a right to expect. "What now?" Chen asked, his voice barely a whisper. Romano smiled grimly as he fed another piece of driftwood to the fire. "Now we do something they'll never expect," he said. "We're going to steal their boat." Through the cabin's salt-stained windows, they could see a Coast Guard patrol vessel anchoring just offshore, its crew preparing to search the island for any signs of the escaped prisoners. The vessel represented their doom or their salvation. Romano began to explain his plan as the sun rose higher over Puget Sound, casting long shadows across the water where three desperate men prepared to attempt yet another impossible escape. Behind them, the greatest manhunt in Pacific Northwest history was just beginning, but ahead lay the slim chance of freedom that had driven them to risk everything. The hunt was on, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. At 2:47 p.m., Coast Guard Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell lowered her binoculars and turned to her commanding officer. "Nothing on the eastern shoreline, sir. No signs of recent landing or campfires." Lieutenant Commander David Harrison nodded grimly from the bridge of the patrol vessel Vigilant. They'd been searching the small islands of northern Puget Sound for 6 hours, methodically checking every possible refuge where escaped prisoners might seek shelter. So far, they'd found nothing but empty beaches and abandoned picnic areas. "Take us around to the north side," Harrison ordered. "We'll do one more sweep before moving to the next island." From the fishing cabin's grimy window, Romano watched the Coast Guard vessel maneuver around the island's rocky perimeter. He'd been observing their search pattern for hours, timing their movements and counting crew members. The Vigilant carried a complement of 8, 4 on the bridge, 2 in the engine room, and 2 conducting the actual shoreline searches. "They're professionals," Romano murmured to Chen, who was huddled near the dying fire. "But they're following standard search protocols. That makes them predictable." Patterson stirred from his exhausted sleep, his massive frame filling the corner where he'd collapsed after their swim. Despite his ordeal, the big man's strength was already returning. Romano would need that strength for what came next. "Here's the plan," Romano said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In 30 minutes, they'll anchor on the north side to search the tidal pools. Standard procedure is to send 2 crew members ashore, while the others maintain position offshore. That's our window." Chen looked at him with bleary eyes. "You're insane. We can barely stand, and you want to attack a Coast Guard vessel." "I want to acquire a Coast Guard vessel," Romano corrected. "There's a difference." FBI agent Torres stood in the Granite Isle Command Center, studying the search grid displayed on a massive electronic map. Red dots marked the positions of patrol vessels, helicopters, and ground teams, while green areas indicated sectors that had been cleared. The search was proceeding with military precision, but so far had yielded nothing. "We've covered 60% of the primary search zone," reported Coast Guard Captain Reeves. "If they're still alive, they're either very lucky or very smart." Torres studied the psychological profile she'd compiled on the 3 escapees. Romano's IQ puts him in the top 2% of the population. He wouldn't attempt this escape without multiple contingency plans. They're not just running, they're thinking several moves ahead. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from the Seattle field office. "Torres. Agent Torres, this is Zach Williams, in Seattle. We've had a development. A fishing boat was reported stolen from Shilsholm Marina at approximately 1400 hours. Harbor Patrol found it abandoned near Vashon Island with signs of recent occupancy." Torres felt her pulse quicken. "Description of the occupants?" 3 males matching the general description of your escapees. Harbor Master says they were asking about boat rentals around noon, claiming to be researchers from the University of Washington." "Researchers?" Torres almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Romano was maintaining his sophisticated approach, even while fleeing for his life. Pull all surveillance footage from the marina. I want facial recognition analysis within the hour. As she hung up, Torres realized that Romano was doing exactly what she'd feared, staying ahead of their search patterns by constantly moving and adapting. The stolen fishing boat was probably just another stepping stone in a larger plan. "Captain Reeves," she called, "I need you to expand the search zone to include all the San Juan Islands, and get me a complete manifest of every vessel that's gone missing in the last 24 hours. Romano crouched behind a fallen log, watching the Coast Guard crew prepare for their shore landing. The Vigilant had anchored, exactly where he'd predicted, in a small cove that provided protection from the afternoon swells. 2 crew members were lowering an inflatable boat while the others maintained their positions on the bridge. "Remember," Romano whispered to his companions, "we need them alive and unharmed. They're following orders, just like we were. This isn't about revenge, it's about survival." Patterson flexed his massive hands. "What about weapons? The crew will be armed, but they're not expecting resistance. We use that to our advantage." Romano checked the improvised equipment they'd assembled from the cabin's contents. Fishing line for restraints, a flare gun that might serve as intimidation, and various tools that could be weaponized if necessary. The inflatable boat reached the shore with Petty Officers Mitchell and Rodriguez aboard. Both were young, competent, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Romano waited until they'd secured their boat and moved inland before giving the signal. The 3 escaped prisoners emerged from the forest like ghosts, surrounding the startled Coast Guard officers before they could react. "Don't move," Romano said quietly. The flare gun pointed at Mitchell's chest. "Don't speak. Don't make any sudden movements." Mitchell's hand started toward her sidearm, but Patterson's massive presence froze her in place. The big man's reputation for violence was well known among law enforcement, and his intimidating stare made verbal threats unnecessary. "We're not going to hurt you," Romano continued, his voice calm and reasonable. "But we are going to borrow your boat. Lie face down, hands behind your heads." Rodriguez, barely out of training, looked like he might panic. Chen stepped forward, his own experience with military discipline evident in his bearing. "Easy, sailor. Do what he says, and you'll be home for dinner." Within minutes, both officers were secured with fishing line and hidden among the trees. Romano had taken their radios and weapons, but more importantly, he'd acquired their radio frequencies and call signs. "Vigilant, this is Shore Team Alpha," Romano spoke into the radio, perfectly mimicking Mitchell's voice. "We've found a campsite, but it looks old. Request permission to extend search to the western ridge." "Copy, Shore Team Alpha," came the reply from Lieutenant Commander Harrison. "Proceed with caution. Report back in 30 minutes. Romano smiled as he pocketed the radio. Now they had a 30-minute window before the crew would expect contact from their shore team. More than enough time for what came next. The 3 escapees reached the Vigilance position by swimming underwater, approaching from the vessel's blind spot near the stern. Romano had studied Coast Guard procedures during his criminal career, and he knew that the remaining crew would be focused on the island, not on threats from the water. Patterson went first, his powerful swimming stroke carrying him silently to the vessel's diving platform. Within seconds he'd hauled himself aboard, and was moving toward the bridge with surprising stealth for such a large man. Romano and Chen followed, timing their movements to coincide with the boat's gentle rocking. The takeover was swift and professional. Patterson appeared on the bridge, like a nightmare made real, his massive frame filling the doorway as he announced their presence. The 4 crew members froze, their training warring with the reality of facing 3 desperate fugitives who had nothing left to lose. "Nobody needs to get hurt," Romano said, as he entered the bridge. Chen behind him, with weapons taken from the shore team. "We just need transportation. Cooperate, and you'll all go home safely." Lieutenant Commander Harrison was the first to recover from his shock. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Assaulting federal officers, hijacking a government vessel, you're adding decades to your sentences." "Only if they catch us," Romano replied. "And right now we're the ones with the boat." Chen had taken control of the engine room, his Navy training allowing him to quickly understand the vessel's systems. Within minutes, he'd disabled the radio and GPS tracking equipment, effectively making the Vigilant invisible to the search coordinators. "Where are we going?" Harrison demanded as Romano took the helm. "International waters," Romano answered, setting course for the Canadian border. 12 miles and we become someone else's problem. The radio silence from the Vigilant was first noticed at 4:15 p.m. when the vessel failed to report its position during a routine check-in. Captain Reeves tried repeatedly to raise Lieutenant Commander Harrison, growing more concerned with each unanswered call. "Could be equipment failure," suggested the communications officer. "Solar storm activity has been interfering with radio traffic all day." But Reeves had a sinking feeling that something more serious was happening. "Get me a helicopter to the Vigilant's last known position and contact all units. We may have a hijacking situation." Agent Torres received the alert while coordinating ground searches near Everett. The news hit her like a physical blow. Romano had done the unthinkable. Instead of running from the authorities, he'd turned and attacked them, seizing one of their own vessels. "Brilliant bastard," she muttered, already calculating the implications. With a Coast Guard cutter, Romano could reach Canadian waters before they could organize an effective pursuit. Once in international waters, the escape would become a diplomatic nightmare involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. "All units, this is Agent Torres," she broadcast on the command frequency. "We have a code red situation. The Vigilant has been hijacked by our escapees. Consider them armed and extremely dangerous." Romano pushed the Vigilant to its maximum speed, the powerful engines driving them northwest toward the invisible line that marked the boundary between American and Canadian waters. Behind them he could see helicopters converging on their position, while ahead lay the promise of sanctuary in foreign waters. "How much farther?" Chen asked from his position at the radar console. 6 miles, Romano replied, checking their GPS coordinates. 20 minutes if we maintain this speed." Lieutenant Commander Harrison stood beside him, forced to watch as his vessel was used to facilitate the very escape he'd been sent to prevent. "You'll never make it," he said. "The Canadians will turn you over the moment you cross the border." "Maybe," Romano admitted, "but that's tomorrow's problem." The sound of jet engines echoed across the water as military aircraft joined the pursuit. F-18 Haunteds from Naval Air Station, Whidbey Island, screamed overhead, their presence a stark reminder of the federal government's determination to prevent the escapees from reaching international waters. "Vigilant, this is U.S. Navy Flight Leader Raptor 1, came a voice over the radio. "You are ordered to reduce speed and return to port immediately. Failure to comply will result in the use of deadly force." Romano keyed the radio. "Raptor 1, this is the Vigilant. We have federal officers aboard as hostages. Any aggressive action will result in their deaths." It was a bluff. Romano had no intention of harming the Coast Guard crew, but it was the only card he had left to play. The threat of civilian casualties would force the military to exercise extreme caution, buying them precious time to reach Canadian waters. In the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, generals and admirals debated the unprecedented situation unfolding in Puget Sound. 3 escaped federal prisoners had hijacked a Coast Guard vessel and were attempting to flee to Canada with 8 hostages aboard. Military protocol called for the immediate use of force, but the presence of innocent crew members complicated the equation. "Options," demanded General Patricia Hayes, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "We could disable their engines with precision gunfire," suggested Admiral Robert Chen, the Chief of Naval Operations. "Force them to stop without sinking the vessel." "Too risky," replied General Hayes. "One stray round could kill a hostage, What about the Canadians? Royal Canadian Navy is scrambling vessels to intercept, but they're at least 40 minutes out, reported the intelligence officer. The hijacked vessel will reach international waters in 18 minutes. General Hayes studied the tactical display, weighing military necessity against the lives of 8 Coast Guard officers. Continue pursuit, but no weapons free until I give explicit authorization, and get me the Attorney General on the line. 4 miles from the Canadian border, disaster struck the Vigilant. Chen had been pushing the engines beyond their design limits for nearly an hour when the port engine began to overheat. Warning lights flashed across the engine room control panel as temperatures rose into the red zone. Engine failure. Chen called over the intercom. Port engine is seizing up. Romano felt the vessel's speed drop immediately as they lost half their propulsive power. The pursuing helicopters began to close the distance, their downdrafts creating whitecaps on the water around the struggling Coast Guard cutter. How long until we reach international waters? Patterson demanded. Romano checked their position against his charts. 3 miles, he said grimly, but at this speed it'll take 15 minutes. Behind them, a massive Coast Guard cutter was rapidly closing the distance, its superior size and power making their escape increasingly unlikely. Romano realized that their desperate gamble was about to fail. They would be captured just short of sanctuary, their impossible escape ending in humiliating defeat. Unless, Chen, Romano called, can you restart that engine? Maybe, but it'll blow completely in 5 minutes. We'd lose all power. Romano made the calculation instantly. 5 minutes at full speed would get them within half a mile of Canadian waters. Close enough, perhaps, for their final gambit. Do it, he ordered. The port engine roared back to life, its damaged components screaming in protest, as Chen pushed it beyond all reasonable limits. The Vigilant leaped forward like a wounded animal, closing the distance to the border at maximum speed, while leaving a trail of black smoke in its wake. Agent Torres watched from a helicopter as the hijacked vessel made its desperate final run for the border. She could see the smoke pouring from its engines, the helicopters swarming around it like angry wasps, and the massive Coast Guard cutter gaining ground with every second. They're not going to make it, Captain Reeves observed from beside her. Engine failure will stop them cold. But Torres wasn't so sure. Romano had surprised them at every turn, always staying one step ahead of their predictions. She had a nagging suspicion that the brilliant criminal still had one more trick up his sleeve. Her suspicion proved correct when the Vigilant suddenly veered toward a group of small islands near the border, its damaged engines finally failing completely. The vessel coasted into a narrow channel between 2 rocky outcrops, disappearing from view as pursuing helicopters circled overhead. Lost visual contact, reported the lead pilot. Target vessel is hidden among the islands. Torres felt her heart sink as she realized what Romano had done. The islands straddled the international border, half in American waters, half in Canadian. If the escapees could reach the Canadian side on foot, they would achieve the sanctuary that had eluded them by sea. Put me down on the nearest island, she ordered. I'm going after them. Romano waded through knee-deep water toward the rocky shore, the Coast Guard crew following under Patterson's watchful eye. The Vigilant sat motionless in the channel behind them, its engines finally silent after their punishing run from Granite Isle. This is as far as we go together, Romano told Lieutenant Commander Harrison. You and your crew stay here. In 1 hour, you'll be rescued and returned to your families. Harrison studied the 3 escapees with professional interest. You know they'll never stop hunting you, he said. There's nowhere you can go that they won't eventually find you. Maybe, Romano replied, but that's the beautiful thing about freedom. It's worth the risk. Chen had located a small boat hidden among the rocks, apparently left by smugglers or fishermen. It was barely seaworthy, but it would carry them the final half-mile to Canadian waters. Romano could see the red and white maple leaf flag flying from a lighthouse on the distant shore, so close he could almost touch it. As they prepared to make their final crossing, the sound of helicopters grew louder. American aircraft circled at the border, forbidden from crossing into Canadian airspace, but ready to pounce if the escapees made any mistake. "Ready?" Romano asked his companions. Chen nodded, his face pale but determined. Patterson simply grunted his agreement, his massive hands gripping the boat's makeshift oars. They pushed off from the American shore just as Agent Torres arrived by helicopter, her aircraft settling onto the rocky beach in a whirlwind of spray and debris. Romano could see her running toward the water's edge, her weapon drawn but useless at this range. The small boat struggled through the choppy waters of the channel, each wave threatening to swamp their fragile craft. Behind them, Torres shouted orders into her radio, coordinating with Canadian authorities who were racing to intercept them. 50 yards from the Canadian shore, their boat finally surrendered to the battering waves and began to sink. The three escapees abandoned their craft and swam the final distance, their strokes growing weaker as exhaustion overtook them. Romano's feet touched the rocky bottom just as Canadian Coast Guard vessels appeared on the horizon. He hauled himself onto the shore and collapsed, his body finally giving in to the ordeal of the past 18 hours. They had done it. They had escaped from the most secure prison in America and crossed international borders despite the largest manhunt in Pacific Northwest history. But as Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers surrounded them with weapons drawn, Romano realized that their escape might have been the easy part. Now came the real challenge, convincing the Canadian government to grant them asylum rather than extradition back to American custody. Vincent Romano, Thomas Chen, Marcus Patterson, announced Sergeant John McLeod of the RCMP. "You are under arrest, pending extradition proceedings to the United States." 6 months later, the courtroom in Vancouver was packed with reporters from around the world as the extradition hearing reached its dramatic conclusion. Romano sat calmly at the defendant's table, his brilliant mind having spent months studying Canadian law and crafting arguments against his return to American custody. His defense had been masterful. Claims of political persecution, arguments about prison conditions that violated international human rights standards, and testimony about corruption within the American federal prison system. The Canadian government found itself caught between diplomatic pressure from Washington and growing public sympathy for three men who had achieved the impossible. Judge Margaret Thompson reviewed her notes one final time before delivering her verdict. The courtroom fell silent as she prepared to speak, the weight of international attention focused on her words. "This court finds that while the defendants clearly committed serious crimes, the conditions of their confinement at Granite Isle Federal Penitentiary constitute cruel and unusual punishment under international standards," she began. "Furthermore, evidence of corruption and abuse within the American prison system raises serious questions about the defendant's safety if returned to custody." Romano felt his heart begin to race as he sensed which way the ruling was heading. Therefore, this court denies the American government's request for extradition. The defendants will remain in Canadian custody pending resolution of their refugee status applications. The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters rushed to file their stories. Romano closed his eyes and smiled, savoring a moment of victory that had seemed impossible just 7 months ago. 2 years later, Vincent Romano stood on the deck of a fishing boat in the North Atlantic, watching the sun set over the coast of Nova Scotia. The Canadian government had eventually granted him refugee status, along with Chen and Patterson. They were free men now, though they could never return to the United States. Chen had found work as a marine engineer, his Navy training and demolitions expertise translating well to civilian maritime operations. Patterson had become a construction foreman, his massive strength and natural leadership making him valuable in the building trades. Romano himself had taken a different path. Using skills developed during his criminal career, he'd become a security consultant, helping businesses protect themselves against the very types of crimes he'd once committed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Agent Torres had never stopped hunting them, even after their legal victory in Canadian courts. She'd pursued every lead, investigated every rumor, and maintained pressure on Canadian authorities to reconsider their decision. But the three men had disappeared into new identities, new lives, and new purposes that put their criminal pasts behind them. As Romano watched the last light fade from the sky, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The escape from Granite Isle had cost them everything, their old lives, their families, their homeland. But it had also given them something invaluable, the chance to become different men. The prison had tried to break them, to reduce them to numbers in concrete cells. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger, men who refused to accept that their fates were sealed, who believed that freedom was worth any risk. Romano pulled his jacket tighter against the Atlantic wind and headed below deck. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new possibilities. For the first time in years, the future was unwritten. Behind him, the lights of Nova Scotia twinkled like stars reflected on the water, welcoming three men who had traded everything for the simple right to choose their own destinies. They had escaped from more than just a prison. They had escaped from the very idea that some cages could never be opened. The hunt was over. The hunted had won. In the end, Romano reflected, the greatest prison wasn't made of concrete and steel. It was made of accepted limitations and surrendered dreams. Breaking free from Granite Isle had been the easy part. Breaking free from the belief that escape was impossible, that had been the real victory.